In this video, you're going to learn all about actions. Actions allow us to actually change the Redux store. We're going to be able to say things like, I'd like to increment the count and I'd like to reset the count to 0. And that's actually going to have an impact on the count. We'll then be able to use a line like this again down below to get the updated version of the data. Currently, if I were to add 2 getState calls, we have the exact same value for each. The value doesn't change because there is no code inside. What we're going to do is actually change the Redux store values, and we're going to do that using actions. Now, an action is nothing more than an object that gets sent to the store. And this object describes the type of action we'd like to take. So let's imagine I'm creating a Redux store for me, a person. I might have an action that says walk. I start walking. I might have stop walking. Then maybe I have sit. And then I have work, and then I have something like stop working, and you get the idea. I have a string of actions that change the state over time. As these actions go off, the state changes. I go from whatever I was to walking, then I stop walking, I sit, I work, and I stop working. The exact same thing is going to be true for our application. So we're going to have various actions like increment. We might have one called decrement as well. We're going to have one called reset. This is going to allow us to change the store over time by just dispatching various actions. So if an action is just an object that gets sent to this store, exactly what does that object look like? Well, we're going to go ahead and create a couple right now, one for each of these sentences. First up, I'd like to increment the count. We're going to define an object, and on this object, we have to define a single property. This is the action type, which is exactly what we just outlined in the comments. So for this one, I want to increment the count. So I'm going to set the type equal to, in quotes, increment. Now you'll notice that I am using all uppercase characters here. This is a convention in Redux for your action type names. It's not enforced, so you could technically use an underscore action name, but it is a convention and I do recommend sticking with it. So if I were to have multiple words, I would use an underscore to separate them. Let's say I have another word after. It would be first word, underscore, second word. In our case, we just happen to have one word, so there is no need for an underscore. So we have this type increment, and what we want to do is actually send this off to the store. Currently, we just have an object defined right here. This is going to have absolutely no effect on the Redux store. If I save the file, you can see that is true. So how do we actually change things? Well, what we need to do is send this to the store, and we do that by calling a method on store. It is store.dispatch. Dispatch actually allows us to send off an action object, and then the store can do something with this information. For example, it can take the count and increase it by 1. So all I'm going to do is take this object, cut it out, and paste it right here inside of parentheses. Now we have a perfectly valid call to dispatch. We are dispatching our very first action, but you'll notice that we still don't have any changes to the state. But at this point, what we do have is something changing inside of this function. So let's go ahead and toss a console.log in here. And we're just going to print running every time this calls. And you'll notice it's actually getting called twice. We get it once right away when the Redux store determines what the default is, and we get it again when we call store.dispatch. If I were to comment out this dispatch call, the second running would go away, and now we see the function just runs a single time. When we do dispatch an action object, though, this function runs again. And now we can actually use the action object to make changes to the state. So how do we access the action object? Well, it actually gets passed in as the second argument to this function. The first one is state, the second one is action, and we're not going to be setting up a default action since the action will indeed get passed in. Now we have access to this information. We can combine the current action with the state to figure out what the new state should be. So what we want to do is take a peek at the action type. If the action type is increment, we want to take the count and actually increase it by 1. Right here, we're going to use an if statement. If action.type is equal to increment. If the action type is equal to increment, we're going to do one thing. If it's not equal to increment, then it means it's the first time our function is running, and all we're going to do is just return the state, the default. So right here, we are going to return state, making absolutely no change to the state. Only when the action type is increment do we actually want to make a change. What change are we going to make? Well, we are just going to return the new state. I'm going to return an object. On this object, I'm going to set a value for count, and I am going to change the count. So I'm going to get the current count and add 1. That would be state.count plus 1. You'll notice that I'm not changing the state. Just like we saw with our this.setStateUpdater functions, we do not want to change the state or the action. That is a bad thing to do. Instead, we just want to use those values to compute the new state. That's what gets returned. Now, if we go ahead and actually save Redux 101 over inside of the browser for the very first time, we have a count that's not 0. We started off with a count of 0, and then we dispatched increment, setting the count equal to 1. Now, if we were to go ahead and add another dispatch call by copying and pasting this code, we're going to see that we can get the count up to 2. So right here, we go from 0 to 2 because we dispatch the increment action twice. Now, it's a much more common pattern to actually use a switch statement inside of this function as opposed to if-else statements. So we're going to go ahead and do that as well. We're going to switch what we do based off of a particular value, and that is the action.type value. And inside of the curly braces, we can define the various cases we want to handle. In our particular case, we have just one increment right here. When action type is equal to increment, we're going to run this case. After the colon, we provide what we want to do. What do we want to do? We just want to return the object we have right here. So I can copy this code and paste it. Perfect. Now, this is the increment case. We're also going to set up the default case. The default case runs if none of the other cases run. And the default case for us is just going to be a return call passing in state. So if it's not increment, we're just going to return the state. These two things have the exact same effect, but as we add more action types, this is a little easier to scale and read than this. So we're going to be sticking with the switch statement. If we save our code, we're going to have the exact same effect. We have made 0 changes to how the program works. We've just switched up the tool we're using to get the job done. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and create another action that we're going to be working with. We're going to go ahead and set up the decrement action. So that action type would be decrement. And this is going to take the count and it's actually going to decrease it by 1. And we already have the action dispatched, which means all we need to do is actually change this function to handle decrement. If I were to save the program right now, we're not going to get an error. What's going to happen is that when this action gets dispatched, it is going to rerun this function. It is going to look at the action type. The action type isn't going to be increment. So we're just going to go to the default case where we return the current state. So this has 0 impact on the state. In order to actually change the state, we have to set up another case right here. For this case, it is the action type of decrement. Now, when we do see the action type of decrement, what do we want to do? We want to return the new store value. We want to return the object where count is something else. We're going to access the current count, state.count, and we are going to subtract 1 from it. Now, if I save Redux 101, we're going to be able to see that the count comes back to 0 because we increment it by 1 and we decrement it by 1. If I were to duplicate the decrement call, we should see -1 as the count value, and that is exactly what we get, which is fantastic. Now it's your turn. What you're going to be doing is dispatching a brand new type of action, and you're going to be setting up our function up above to actually handle that action correctly. Right here, the action that you're going to be setting up is going to be reset, and this is going to set the count equal to 0. So when I dispatch reset, I want to completely set the count equal to 0, which means if I were to keep things in this order, I would change it from 0 to 1, from 1 back to 0, I would reset it to 0 again, and then I would use this to decrement it to -1. We're going to go ahead and tweak that a little bit. So what I'm going to do is dispatch right here, increment. Then down here, we'll go ahead and actually use decrement. So this is going to bring it from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, you're going to reset it to 0, and the end result will be -1. So you're only going to see -1 if you actually reset it. If I were to save the program as it currently stands, we're going to see a count of 1 because the reset code currently does nothing. It's going to be your job to actually reset things. So take some time to knock this one out, set up the handler for reset, and dispatch the action object. When you're done, make sure you're seeing a count of -1, then you can go ahead and click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get everything set up correctly and you were able to see reset working. Right here, I'm going to kick things off by dispatching the new action, even though we don't have a case for it, in our switch statement above. Store.dispatch. I'm going to pass in the action object. And there are other things we can put on here, but for now, we're just looking at dispatching basic objects. So we're just going to define the type. I'm going to go ahead and set type equal to, right here, inside of quotes, reset. Now that we have the dispatch call in place, we can actually handle that because currently, while it is going to cause our function to rerun, the function doesn't know what to do when it sees an action type of reset, so it defaults to doing absolutely nothing. We're going to handle that by adding a new case right here. So this case is going to be for when the action type is reset, and in that particular case, we want to run some code. This code is just going to return a new object, and on that object, we are going to set count equal to 0. And there we have it. That is all we need to do to handle the reset action. If I go ahead and save Redux 101 down below, we do get a count of -1. We go from 0 to 1. We then go from 1 to 2. We reset it back to 0. We decrement it to -1. Now that we have actions in place, we're going to go ahead and look at some more advanced techniques we can use to track data. But for now, let's take a quick moment to recap what we learned in this one. In this video, we learned that actions are our way of communicating with the store. An action is nothing more than an object, and currently all of our objects just have a single property type. This is the one thing we have to provide, although later on we'll look at other things we can provide right here. When we create this action object, we have to actually get it to the store, and we do that using store.dispatch. So here we are dispatching 4 separate actions, all of which have a meaningful effect on the Redux store's state. Up above, we actually handle these dispatch calls with the function passed to create store. So we learned that this gets called once right when we call create store to set up the default state, and one time for every store.dispatch call. So every time I dispatch an action object, we can access that action object as the second argument. We can take a look at the type, and based off of the type, we can make meaningful changes to the state, whether it's incrementing, decrementing, or resetting the count. All of this allows us to create a Redux store that we can read from and change. In the next video, we're going to look at more advanced techniques, getting into more real-world examples. I'm very excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.